to.
Okay. What page are you on?
Well, for example,
right.
I mean, it recurs.
Yes, it does.
Right. But on 368, in the middle of the text, which I don't think is the first time that comes up.
Right.
And then related to that, there's also a question about something outside of existence. Outside of existence, I had a question about.
Okay. That one I don't know where that is. That on the same page?
It would be on the same page. Let me just see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, at the bottom, that every logical element is an essentially relative unity, that the outside of existence is existence itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So the outside of existence, I can't get my
it's a cute way of saying that there is no outside of existence.
Thank
you. What used to be the outside of existence
yeah,
is no
right.
longer that.
Well, yes, in the sense it's not just cute, because it's a cute way of referring to the fact that in previous thinking there is the notion that there is something outside of existence, which is a kind of a nothing, that's there. So in that sense, it's a denial of that past state of affairs in which you could, as it were, distinguish between existence or being and non-being. Okay, so or existence and nothing, or existence and non-existence, something like that. So it's just a way of saying or emphasizing that there is existence. Existence absolutely exists. Right? Okay. Now, as far as the created 100 goes, that on page 360, I think you. What did you point me?
368. I said
yeah. That actually, I think, is pretty much the beginning of that notion, where what I'm doing there is calling it. Well, let's turn back to 367, and you look at that that Z-type circle in which I have placed. Let's see if we get the page references for that. Are going to take us back to the logical chapter. What I call the logical chapter, my shorthand for it, 274 thereabouts, I'm guessing. Yeah. And I think Alia had a question that got muted somewhere along the line a meeting or two back about this section. These are all the diagram on pages 275 and the diagram on page 367. 265. I'm sorry. I should have said 275 if I didn't. And 367. All right. Now those diagrams are related, but before we try and understand how they're related, they go back to what's on page 274. So in other words, this is a kind of visual transcription. That is, on page 275, it's a transcription into a diagrammatic form of the relationships that are delineated at the top of page 274. Okay, and then on page 367, which I think brings us into last time's assignment, what you have is a further simplification of the diagram on 275. Okay, I'm not sure. I mean, if you want to, we can, but I don't know how necessary it is to go through a detailed mathematical analysis of that. But the point is that in the logical chapter, you start with this notion of the minimum order, 4, 1, 2, 3, right? And then this order, 4, 1, 2, 3, has variations, which I call, one of which, principle is the logical order, which is 1, 2, 4, 3. In other words, where the third and fourth places going 1, 2, 3, 4 are reversed. And then there's what is called the substantive equivalent of that, where you start with 4, 1, 3, 2. All right. So what's going on in these diagrams is the transcription of the logical order and the relationships that are ultimately, in other words, what the reflection and inversion, the I and the R in these diagrams refers to ultimately, okay, is on page 268, is the turning of the cornerstone, right, on page 268, where you have the cornerstone set up in an order that's labeled 4, 1, 2, 3, and and that's probably that. You'll pardon the expression. That is the foundational starting place of all of this other jazz, and the simple idea there. If you look at number 4, which is the first one, okay, and then look at number 2, you will see literally, visually, that 1 following 4, the cornerstone following the 4 cornerstone, is literally the mirror image of it. It's literally the reflection of it. Everybody with me? Say so if you're not. I don't mind repeating myself. Okay? So it's literally the reflection. So 1 is the reflection of 4. And then 2 is the let's see if, yeah, it should be the inversion. Let's see if I got that right. Yeah, it is. It's the 2 is the inversion of 1. Do you see?
Upside down.
Yeah, that's right. Turning over. So it's all semantics. It's also a mirror image, but instead of being a horizontal mirror image, it's a vertical mirror image. You got it? And so to distinguish the horizontal from the vertical, linguistically, call one the reflection and call the other the inversion. But it's all, like so much, it's relative. It's contextual. All right? And then 3 in that foundational order, the minimum order, 3 in turn is going to be the reflection, the mirror in the horizontal normal sense of the inversion. Right. So that is the literal. I don't know if literal is the right word. That is the immediate perceptual basis for the labeling that goes on in that diagram later on. Where 367? No, the 275. I think it was. You see, so if you look at 275 closely, you see that you have I's and R's in there, and if you go back over on page 274, 4 is identified as the inversion of 1 and the reflection of 3. Do you see? That's based on what that simple analysis that I've just shown you to be the case on page 268. So it's a question of abstracting those relationships, putting numbers on them appropriate to which one of the turns of the foundations of the cornerstone is being referred to, and then diagramming that set on page 274, that set of each one is an inversion of one and a reflection of the other, labeling which is which, and then abstracting from that into a diagrammatic form on page 275. Right? So that's the basic procedure. And actually, you see, while in a certain sense you look at it, it's very daunting, and by the way, it can take some time to concentrate on it to figure it all out on this page, on page, let's say, 275, nevertheless, it's really very simple, okay? In other words, it just starts from that simple rotation of the cornerstone, and it just attempts to delineate that in various forms, right? And once that procedure takes place, when we get to last time's assignment on page 267, if you take the numbers in the 4 directions, as it were, in other words, imagine the XY coordinate system directions, you see east, west, north, south. If you take the sets of numbers in the diagram on 275 and just abstract them, in other words, make the diagram that much simpler, you see, and so then you get on page 267, abstracting from the diagram on 275, you get the set, for example, on the left-hand side of the horizontal.
You get 367? You mean 367?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
You get 2, 4, 3, 1, and then on the right-hand side of that horizontal, you're going to get a set in which the order is 4, 2, 1, 3, going toward the center, and top down 3, 3, 2, 2. All of which is abstracted from the diagram at 275, which in turn is based on the turning of the cornerstone. Okay, that's really all that's going on. And as I say, while at first blush, you say, well, what is all this? Nevertheless, if you follow it one step at a time, you can follow it. It's not really esoteric. Okay, now all of which is to say that when I get to 367, I'm adding up, as you can see from the corner numbers, the 4 corner numbers, I'm adding up the numbers in each direction, and I'm getting 24, 36, 24, and 16. Do you see the the outermost numbers. We're on page 367. The outermost numbers, and I'm taking the sums of those 4 directions of that particular diagram, the furthest simplification in the text of the more complicated forms previously, and I've set that up as a proportion, because it is a proportion. In other words, when I say I set it up as a proportion, I notice it is a proportion, and I deal with it as such. In other words, 16, in fact, is to 24 proportionally, as 24 is to 36. And the ratio between 16 and 24 is 1.5. 1.5 times 16 is 24, and 1.5 times 24 is 36. All right? Now, I label that proportion. 16 is to 24 is to 36. I label that the absolute proportion of absolute thought. Now, why would I put such a term on it? Because I have derived this proportion from the logical analysis in chapter 3.1. All right. In other words, so this is a derivative of the fundamental, what I call elsewhere later on, the real trinary logic of the thinking now occurring. And what you'll notice in there, or what I noticed in there, and what led me to take this with some seriousness, is the occurrence not only of certain fundamentally important numbers that are related to the logical chapter. Remember, toward the end of the logical chapter, there is a kind of mathematical manipulation that produces a 1 equals either 36 or the inverse of 36, right? So that, and that's further abstracted to say that 1 equals 1 sub 36, comma, inverse of 36. So I'm saying there logically that the ultimate mathematical number, Jim was trying to insist last time, and I was denying, that the logical digits are numbers. They're not, the logical digits as such are not numbers, although they are the foundation of the numerical system, you might say, or of ordinary mathematics, and they're not numbers themselves per se, even though they can be read, even though I can substitute for 0 and unum, 0.5, because I take advantage of the fact that logically 0 and unum, which are not numbers, do equal logical 1. So what I in effect do is I say, okay, let's allow for reading that 1 mathematically. If we did that, then we would have to consistently read 0 and unum mathematically. And if 0 and unum equal a mathematical 1, analogous to the fact that they equal a logical 1, right, a logical unity, would they equal? According to the logic, as I think I said last time in a different context, they would have to each equal 0.5, because they equal each other addition-wise in the logic. Okay. Now, so when I looked at this diagram here, what was interesting to me was that it culminates, so to speak. The end extreme is 36. So, and also it adds up to, if you add up the numbers in the proportion, it adds up to 100, which is what triggered me on to go back this, kind of reconstitute this, right? And it turns out that in the Hebrew, let's see if we can get back to the page you started us on, which was the next page, page 368. It turns out that in the Hebrew, dropping down 9 or so lines on page 368, and you just pardon my pronunciation here, bara, I would pronounce it, but I do that with no authority. The Hebrew word for to create, okay, which is the 3-letter word, you can see there transcribing the mathematical value of each of those letters gives me, according to the methodology of the way in which the thinking now occurring handles the mathematical transcription of language, it gives me the proportion 2 is to 200 as 1 is to an implied 1, right? And the rational product of that mathematical transcription of to create turns out to be 1 over 100. One, how would we say? 1/100th. 1/100th? Something like how we say it in English, right? Okay. And so and this is part of the outrageousness of the thinking now occurring, which is outrageous in a number of directions simultaneously. I outrageously take that seriously. Right? I'm outrageous enough to think that it's probably significant that to create has as its rational product, which I otherwise refer to as the identity, the mathematical identity of any given number or any given linguistic expression that's been thus translated. And I'm doing that because at the same time, and you understand, coming down, it's, I don't know, we used this analogy once before in class, and I can't remember what the context was, but it's as if, I'm at a loss for bookmarkers here, it's as if you were coming down different roads that converged, as it were. You came down this road, you come down this road, and son of a gun, you come to the same place, as it were, the same, right? Both roads, independently, as it were, when you start out, bring you to the same spot. So the logical analysis that's kind of encapsulated in those more or less complex or simple diagrams, right? Which includes the notion within itself, you see, of a kind of centrality of 36 and the centrality when I add up the numbers in the absolute proportion of absolute thought of 100. You see what I'm saying? When I notice that when I go look at the Hebrew, taking a different route, it would seem altogether, I'm being pointed in the same direction. All right. So when I want to conceptualize in the context of the thinking now occurring, the logico-mathematical significance of the notion of creation, I'm guided both by the logic, which prescinds, in the technical sense, altogether and predates the linguistic analysis. I'm guided by that logical analysis to associate the totality of creation, if I can, for want of a better term, speaking a little bit loosely, the whole, I like that better in the Greek sense, the wholeness of creation. I'm associating that in a logical, mathematical way with 100. And son of a gun, when I turn to the Hebrew, I see the Hebrew kind of confirms my logical focus on 100 as a creation number, to put it grossly. All right, that's all right. Now, what I then do, and this is, what's new on page 368 and following, the created 100, which is what triggered this particular focus. Where does that come from? All right, the first notion, which I'm trying to articulate there on, actually, it first does appear on page 368, I think, is the notion. Let's see if I can explain it this way: that so if 100 represents the whole of creation in a logical mathematical context, okay, then the notion would be, so obviously there are 28,000 things in the room, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a logical mathematical understanding of the wholeness of creation, and therefore that's why you always have to be careful not to too quickly or too simply translate logic into mathematics, right? There is a way of going from one to the other, but they're not simply interchangeable. Okay. So if you buy for a moment the concept, the logical mathematical concept that I will associate the whole of creation, of the created world, with 100, then in this logical mathematical context, the notion would be that anything in that world is a part of that, is a part of the 100. It's right. So again, simplifying logical mathematically, what otherwise could be very complicated, to say. The logical mathematically, the notion is that every one of those, of the 100, every single one that adds up, so to speak, to 100, now here, this goes back to what we started with, the outside of existence is existence, okay? Every one is intrinsically defined as being one of 100. So every one is 100th. It has no. You understand the conceptual bridge here, that there is no nothing, right? Or in the language that gets a little more difficult in today's and last time's reading, that we have a nothing that is ex nihilo. I mean, what nothing we have is after nothing. What nothing we have is a created nothing. What nothing we have is that nothing which I cannot actually have, but that it is existence. All right. So that inseparability of what hitherto could be a distinguishable nothing from existence in the context of the thinking now occurring. It's analog in terms of the simple number 100 taken as a logical mathematical focus of the wholeness of creation, that everything understood, every one of the 100, doesn't exist outside of, other than being one of 100. So every one is 100th. Okay? So now
you're saying that all of the different, I think you are saying this, that every different theology or metaphysics in which there is some kind of hyperousia or urgrund or ungrund or abgrund or whatever.
Right. Hyperousia, hyper beings, right? Something beyond being. Urgrund, fundamental ground, ultimate source.
That wherever that would be proposed, that's sort of folded back into existence as creation itself. In other words, insofar as those cosmologies or ontologies make sense,
that's right.
They only make sense insofar as that which is outside of existence is folded back into creation.
Yes, okay, it's folded back in, but in an absolute sense. In other words, or to put it more simply, I would deny that there is any such thing as an Urgrund or Abgrund or something like that in the Heideggerian sense. You see, all of that which previously there was room for, so to speak, there's no room for in the thinking now occurring. And it goes to the notion, which will be developed later on in the text, the notion of an infinitely flat structure of the universe, right? So you could expand that a little bit and say an infinitely flat structure of reality, right? So there, in that sense, the denial of distance in the thinking now occurring, or the setting aside at the end of Alpha in Novitas Mundi, the displacing of space itself. These are all different. They're all variants on this notion of the absolute immediacy of absolute immediacy. Immediacy is absolute and intelligible. So in today's assignment, when we get to, we're going to revisit Derrida in a rather extensive footnote, right? And we're revisiting in that footnote, among other things, the notion that was done explicitly in section 2.3, which is the chapter devoted to Derrida's work as a whole. The notion that in the context of the thinking now occurring, the text, say, he's into the text, and what he's saying is that the text is radically undecidable, right? It's radically a matter of difference, radically, right? It's referring, it never ultimately has a referent, right? An ultimate referent. You see, it's as it were text all the way down, but in his reading of that, he reads that negatively. In fact, in today's assignment, I'm going to get to it, I hope, but it's there, so I'll just spell it out loud and clear. I noticed in rereading the text that in the citation of Derrida today, the notion that Derrida is denying that the text has any referent, or that the signifier is really a signifier because it doesn't signify anything other than itself. That would be Derrida's reading, you see. So you could say, in a certain sense, he's taking advantage and kind of being satisfied with the ultimately, what I would call, or the thinking now occurring would understand, as the ultimately self-referential nature of modern self-consciousness. And Derrida is using that ultimate self-referential nature of the Hegelian synthesis against the Hegelian synthesis. See? And of course, there's no answer to Derrida in that sense. I mean, he's, in a certain sense, he's right, but in order to turn the ultimate absolute self-reference of self-consciousness against itself, you see, to defeat it with its own absolute self-referentiality, he must at the same time somehow be in violation of it, or a little more in the Derridean spirit, he violates it, right? He violates the absolute self-consciousness, and the only way you can violate an absolute self-consciousness is the resort to a kind of absolute meaninglessness, an absolute brutality in a certain sense, which I've previously identified it as earlier on in the text, all right? But I thought today, in preparing today's assignment, I thought, well, wait a minute, let's slow down here a little bit, and why are we taking Derrida so seriously? And it's so obvious, but I don't think I ever actually say it point blank in the text. The thinking now occurring agrees with Derrida, right? That the text doesn't signify, right? But whereas Derrida takes that as a negative, that as the opening to the abyss, right? analogously, by the way, in today's recapturing of Altizer, the door is I and I is the door, but the door, I am the door and the door is I, but the door, says Altizer, opens to nowhere. That's Altizer's version. That's his version of what in Derrida would just be the abyss, to say. So what I'm getting at is that the thinking now occurring agrees with Derrida in a number of ways, but this kind of really encapsulates a key point of agreement that yes, the text does not signify, but the fact that it doesn't signify is only a negative. It's only an abysmal thought if you think there's something outside of the text. In other words, if you take the outside of the text serious enough to deny that there's anything there to begin with, you know what I'm saying? But if you deny the validity altogether, absolutely, of even the very notion of referring to an outside of the text, positively or negatively, do you say? Then, true, the text doesn't signify, but the reason it doesn't signify is it is the existence which is text itself, where existence which is text itself is our creation. Right? We are I don't really like the word author, but we are the constructors, we are the makers of the text. Do you see? So, and so yes, it's not meaningful, but it's intelligible. That is, it's not a matter of intention, it's a matter of doing, as I try and say in a number of ways, yeah.
I'm just reminded, you said this actually.
Okay.
When you were talking
in the
about
text?
Derrida, you did exactly say what you say.
Okay.
Right now.
Okay. All right. Okay. Now, I wonder... but analogously here in this crazy math, or crazy logical math, you see, it's the same idea expressed in a kind of a calculus. All right? So in other words, I can state this conceptually, but I also want to be able to state it in a calculable way, either in a logical mathematical way. I certainly want to state it logically, but I also want to be able to state it in a logical mathematical way. And yes, certainly in the analysis of the language, Greek or Hebrew, I want to be able to see it operating in what you could call a straightforward mathematical way. Right? So these things are not simply the same thing, but they are deeply related to one another, although distinguishable levels or aspects of the analysis. But conceptually, it's the idea that every one is one of 100. So now, the created 100 is to, I'll use, this is very risky to do this, but to use the notion of folding back. If you fold back if you start with 100, and you have the conceptual notion that every one of the 100 has no identity other than it's one of 100, then you could predicate of that 100, do you see? Since it's composed of 100 ones of 100, what in effect is 100 squared. Do you see? The created 100 is just just a verbal transcription of 100 over 0.01, which is just a simple mathematical way of making fully explicit that the whole of creation, I can predicate. And the other important idea that's lurking in this little mathematical, whatever this is, I have a kind of a relative who thought when I described the thinking now occurring to her, there's something very playful about it, which I think is okay. In this little game, and I don't mean game in the sense of game theory, okay, but in the playfulness, the freedom, right, to move across boundaries, where to move through walls, so to speak, that otherwise would be there. The other notion of the 100 over 0.01, in other words, making fully explicit that every one of the 100 is one of 100, what that further makes explicit conceptually is what is already said there in that logical, what I call the logical chapter 3.1, when I'm talking about, when I do at the end there, that there's a kind of an identification of 36 each. It's the same principle. Each of the 1/36, each one of 36 is conceptually understood to be the whole. So where I'm going here is that the part is not less than the whole in the thinking now occurring. Right? So it goes to the broader notion that we've been discussing in here for quite some time, I think, the notion of a kind of absolute particularity, right? Which I one day found myself calling, which based on some aspect of the text here, which I think we jumped ahead to look at and we'll probably come across again, that there's no totalization going on here because each particular in the absolute particularity of existence is effectively a totality. We have a kind of infinity of totalities, you see, but totalities that are totalities qua parts. They're qua particular. They're not. You see that there's no. So in that sense, now I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and I don't know if this will come out right, but I think thought has a history, right? And of course, the earliest development of these very fundamental questions undertaken by the Greeks really boils down at the level at which I'm talking now. In other words, pre-Platonic, pre-Socratic philosophy, in the discussion, in effect, that was going on, whether it was direct or not exactly in their particular cases, but in effect, the dialogue that was going on in pre-Socratic philosophy between the atomists and Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras was a Greek philosopher who said, like the atomists, that everything was composed of infinitely small parts, as it were. As far as that went, there was no disagreement, or an infinite number, let me specify that a little more fully, an infinite number of infinitely small parts. The atomists taught it and taught it, and Anaxagoras thought something similar at first blush and taught it. The difference was that what makes atomism, I'm talking about classical Greek atomic theory, is that an atom, by definition in Greek, atomos, is the indivisible, uncuttable something, right? In other words, it's when you, as it were, when you divide through the universe, the matter of the universe, the atomic theory says you will come to something that is infinitely small, but the key point is that it's indivisible. All right? In other words, there'll come a point where you can't get any smaller. Is that infinitely small? Infinite number of... Yeah, well, infinitely small in the sense of invisible, let's put it that way, indiscernible, right? Whereas Anaxagoras says, when you cut through, as it were, when you divide any material thing, anything of your cosmic experience, you will never come to an indivisible. So at root, he presents the antithesis of the atomic theory. Now, what are the advantages of the two theories? Well, the advantage of the atomic theory is that there's an end to your division, right? In other words, it has a kind of, well, if I use the language of thinking now occurring, this will help me make the point I was about to make. There's a minimum. In the atomic theory, there's a minimum point of division. The unfortunate part of it is, as Aristotle would be quick to point out, it's absurd, okay? The atoms are, they exist beneath or before the level of mind, of rationality. They are, if you can imagine, they are pure. This is another reason I think why Aristotle didn't care much for the atomic theory, right? But if you can imagine such a thing, it's not thought through in Aristotelian terms, but it's like invisible, effectively, was certainly an infinite number, probably infinitely small in a perceptual sense, of atoms, each one of which is totally mindless, totally purely matter. If you could imagine a multiplication of pure matter in an Aristotelian sense, see, he couldn't imagine it because that would already be giving it form from Aristotle's point of view. Okay, but the atomic theory doesn't start with him. So I mean, from where he starts, and it also precedes him, so it's subject to his criticism, right? But anyway, so what is the atomic theory? It's an infinite number of particles of matter that exist before there's any reason or consciousness or mind. So mind in the atomic theory is epiphenomenal. In other words, life and mind are the result of the purely accidental collision of what I'm, for want of a better term, these nuggets of mindlessness, right? So out of a kind of mindlessness, out of a kind of sheer accident without mind, arises by chance, just a intelligible order. But since it's grounded in this purely mindless, irrational, accidental collision of atoms in a void, it has no ultimate coherence. See? That's the atomic theory in a nutshell. Anaxagoras says, no, everything we find in the world is infinitely divisible in the full sense of the word. That is, I can never come to use the language of thinking now occurring, I can never come to a minimum point of division. I can never come to the end of that division. And so the consequence of that is that whatever is intelligible in the world has an intelligible form, cannot be reduced, as it is in the atomic theory, to a mindless substrate of accidental something or others, right? Well, if it can't be reduced to that, then anything I find that has an intelligible specific form in the world, I can divide through and get infinitely smaller versions of that same specificity. You see? So by being able to divide through the world of my experience infinitely, in the full sense of the word, in principle, in Anaxagoras, I have a world which is intelligible. Now watch, it's going to sound familiar, but this is what I want to get to. It's intelligible all the way down, okay? Except that there's no minimum, there's no end, right? It's all the way down, but all the way down, it has something of the quality of an abysmal regress. Do you see that? So imagine what the thinking now occurring is then. It's a solution to their problem. I mean, it's much more than that, but I mean, you see what I'm saying? Because in the thinking now occurring, what we're saying is that there is a minimum. There is a starting point, and yet the world is specific, intelligible, particular, all the way down. You see? And therefore there's no need for totality in the totalizing sense. You see? Every particular is the beginning and end of its own intelligibility. It doesn't rely upon anything outside of itself for its intelligibility. You can apply that to persons. Do you see? It's the same principle applied in different areas, looking at it from different angles or through a different lens. Right? So in that sense, the thinking now occurring is a synthesis of one of the most fundamental problems of Western thought. Right, of the alternatives presented in Greek consciousness between an atomic basis which is unintelligible and a purely intelligible basis which is unfortunately abysmally, right, which there's no end in the division. Well, they say, well, wait a minute, how can you put them together? Well, you put them together if the end is right in front of your nose. Right, you know what I'm saying? In other words, if the intelligibility is immediate, then you've achieved, in effect, immediately what the atomic theory has to go searching for in the depths of the indiscernible aspect of our perception of the world. Right. So the flatness of the world is not just an arbitrary way of thinking. Right. It's that is to say, the lack of depth is that I have in the immediacy of immediacy of actual experience, the identity of the person, right? In the immediacy of actual experience, the identity of the person, or you might say, because in the thinking now occurring, there's no absolute distinction here. I have in the actual immediacy of experience, I have the identity of the thing, okay? And therefore, I have what the atomic theory had and what Anaxagoras had. I have the absence of an infinite regress. I have a place beyond which I cannot, as it were, divide in ancient terms, right? And at the same time, I have the infinite intelligibility or specificity, or really, although Anaxagoras may not have put it this way, the infinite particularity of existence. Taking the particular as the second moment, the species, the essence, that which is the pivot of all intelligibility. Right? All right. So the numbers or the logical mathematical treatment is just as it were, a distillation, another aspect of what's going on here. In this case, a distillation of the general concepts into the form of that itself can be manipulated in a calculating way, where calculating has no negative connotations. Oh, okay. Let me just pause there. Other objections, questions? Okay.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
Is there a conversion table to go from the Greek or Hebrew letters to numerical values?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I put one in the book, but it's standard. In other words, if you pick up, yeah, there is such a table. The shorter answer is, and I'm trying to think where I would refer you. If you have a Greek dictionary, if you look at the letter in each, alpha, beta, when you go to alpha, you're going to get alpha right up front. They'll give you the.
I got a book called Theomatics, and it's got some of this stuff in it, but I thought there might be a simple.
Yeah, except I can't give you. Yes, there is, but I mean, any book on Greek mathematics would tell you right away. The first thing they'd have to tell you is that the Greeks didn't have numbers; they had letters, and they assigned what we would call numerical values to each of the letters of the alphabet. Right? And that's one of the reasons, I think I've said this before, just to emphasize it, it's one of the reasons why I'm comfortable with doing what I'm doing with the Greek and the Hebrew, because I'm not imputing a numerical value to these letters. And the people who originally imputed numerical values to these letters were not the ancient mystics. Right? The ancient mystics may have taken advantage of it, like the thinking now occurring takes advantage of it in a different technical way, okay? But there's an objective, mathematical, scientific, as it were, basis for the identification of letters and the numbers. Yeah.
The actual attribution of the numbers to the letters is added late in classical time. It's not earlier. It's not the actual earlier text.
Right.
You don't have those attributions to them. It's only once they've been.
What are we talking about time when you say late?
Well, 5th century or later. The 5th century is when the Masoretic text is established.
Oh, maybe in the Hebrew case, I don't know. I mean, I'll take your word tentatively for that. I think that would not be true of the Greeks, because
how did they calculate
Greek mathematics? They used. There's no question, but that they used the Greek letters. Yeah.
How did they calculate before that 5th century event?
I'm not sure what you mean by.
Sure. Well, you mean how would they do arithmetic if they didn't have those letters? I'm not
Which
sure.
5th century are we talking about, by the way?
BC.
Oh, okay. Oh, then we're in the same ballpark. Okay.
But
Okay.
the text exists longer before that. The text of the Bible exists as
Right.
a string of letters. Long
I understand. All right, I got you. Okay. And therefore, we could hypothesize, although I don't know how we'd ever know, it may be that the Hebrews learned this technique from the Greeks. The Greeks would have always, as soon as they started doing mathematics, they would have used letters because they had nothing else to use. So, right? So, and the Greeks had a scientific interest which the ancient Hebrews didn't have.
Although there's certainly lots of calculations that are going on in the earliest.
That's
levels
true.
of the
Well, hey,
text.
and I'm all for that, right? Right. Yeah. All right. But we don't associate. In other words, the origins of Western mathematics are generally understood without much debate, I think, to be Greek. Yeah.
What is it about the rational selection of the rational product as opposed to the integral product or the I forget the other one?
Well,
That's
yeah.
not arbitrary.
It's a good question. I think the best answer I can give you is I'm not entirely clear on what it is that is not arbitrary about it. For me, it's something of an open question, a question which I haven't worried about, as it were, intellectually much, because the guiding principle is context. So, in other words, if I'm selecting for rational product and I'm doing so in the context consistently, that's good enough for me, right? But yes, it's an interesting question to which I don't have any definitive answer as to why one might select the rational product as opposed to the integral product, or vice versa. Now, having said that, I have a tentative sense. I have a sense of it. I don't have a definitive answer. I have a sense of it, which comes out in I find myself identifying or labeling the rational product the identity number of the word or the verse, and the integral product the absolute number. Okay, so. This doesn't perfectly satisfy me, and so therefore, if it doesn't perfectly satisfy you, we're on the same wavelength, okay? But my sense is that the rational product has more to do with the close-in focus, the identity of this particular concept, as it were. The absolute or the integral product, the absolute value of the letter or the number of the word or the verse or phrase. I see that in the kind of comprehensive sense, right? Relating, focusing on its place in the whole order of things, right? So, for example, to go back to, I gave you the key example which comes up at the end of today's assignment in a linguistic context of the 82944 number, which has a mathematical uniqueness of its own independently of any Hebrew and Greek. But you can apply to 82944 the same analysis, and you get the identity factor, the rational product, as I think I pointed out last time, is 36. You say, which, so in the language of the thinking now occurring, the rational product of 82944, rational product is its identity factor because it identifies 8294, intrinsically identifies the number as its rational product, identifies it with what I know to be logically and from further linguistic analysis with the concept of unity. But the whole uniqueness of 82944 from the purely mathematical point of view is that it has qua integral product the properties, and it has it uniquely, even compared to 784, it has the properties of unity, mathematical unity, right? So when I see what I call the identity factor or the rational product of 82944 is 36, then I'm saying, what I'm saying to you is that reinforces my sense, my intuition, that the rational product has something to do with telling me about the structure or nature of this particular concept, right? 82944 is a unity idea, mathematically, and it tells me that itself through its rational product. Do you see what I'm saying? And I can discover that fact about it, or confirm that fact about it, when I do the purely mathematical analysis called the integral product manipulation. Right? When I multiply the odd number digits of 82944, I discover that it has the same properties as the mathematical one. So in that sense, the absolute value, or the integral product of 82944, which is 82944, you see, relates it to a larger picture in my mind, to say, of a purely mathematical property of one.
Yeah, but to the extent that 784 and 82944 share the same integrity, if you will, are they equal? I mean, could you write down 784 equals 82944?
I wouldn't do that.
Why
not? Why wouldn't I do that?
I mean,
what's more interesting to me...
They are two unique numbers
Right.
along with one, right?
Correct. What makes them unique is that they share certain properties with one.
Yeah.
So they have
But
about them
but
as...
they only, no other numbers.
Well, share this particular set of properties.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So
And-
in
and
that
well-
sense, are they identical?
No, they're not identical, not only because they're two different numbers, but also because in terms of where the thrust of your question is that 784 is not, even in this analysis, identical with 82944, because 82944 is more perfectly, if I can put it that way, identical, has the values of 1 than 784. 784 is identical with 1 in this context, like 82944, but less perfectly so. So in that is true. In other words, I can the integral product of the third part of 82944 is the ninth part of 82944, which is not true of 784.
I mean, every number is an individual. That's almost by definition.
Yeah.
So you can't.
But in one
Just
respect,
from-
in one respect, they're identical. But in the context of what I'm doing here, there yet hasn't a reason to put it quite that way, to equate them. And I've given you at least one good reason for not doing so. All right, now let's see. Let me just orient myself here so we. All right, we have the. Yeah, we need to back up a little bit here into last time's assignment, and some of which we touched on. I think a key thing that's going to be I think we were trying to get to Maimonides last time, which would probably not be a bad idea. Yeah, and the Maimonides discussion, which will both illustrate how I conceptually use this mathematical linguistic methodology, how I relate it conceptually, how I use it conceptually, and at the same time it will lead to a larger logical question that comes up in the distinction between Peirce's pragmatism, his logic, and the trinary logic. So we'll close a couple of circles if we take a look, if we back up a little bit here into the text of Maimonides, and taking a look first at the text quoted. Yeah, but I want to start before that on 360, where he's discussing the what he calls, or what is called in the Latin nomen proprium, the proper name of God, toward the bottom of 360. And in the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides says, "It is well known that all the names of God occurring in Scripture are derived from his actions, except one, namely the tetragrammaton." Now, tetragrammaton is just a traditional term. It means 4 letters. That's what it's a Greek term. It means the 4-letter word. That's what it. Right? That's strange, right? In English, okay. But that's the name of God. But Maimonides is identifying it as the proper name of God, as it were. It's God's personal name, if I could put it that way. Right?
You could know that just in generally in the Hebrew commentaries, there's a 72-letter name, there's a 7-letter name, there's a 48-letter name, all these different. So they just use those ways of distinguishing those different names. So this is the 4-letter name.
Okay, but Maimonides' point is more than that. In other words,
I'm just saying that's the grammar.
That's right. There are many names that God has, but Maimonides is saying that this one, those other names of God, are derived from God's actions. But there's one, the tetragrammaton, that is the 4-letter name of God, which has now, in our current English translation usage, is what is translated as Yahweh. All right? Or if you went back 100 years in America, and you still have the Jehovah's Witnesses coming around. So Jehovah is just another way of transcribing the tetragrammaton. But the current preference academically would be Yahweh over Jehovah. That's the same word.
Are there 2 and 3-letter names of God?
Yes. Yeah, and some of them are in our text.
Oh.
Yeah. Or terms for God, at least.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
God is a 3-letter word.
In English. Okay.
You,
But the name...
In German it's 4.
Okay.
Jew, Jews,
German is 4.
French, Jew.
4. And in Latin it would be 4 deus. And in Greek it would be 4 theos. So 4 is a good number, as Pythagoras was very aware. Okay, and therefore it's...
English is a very American language, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, God it's a 3-letter word in English.
Right.
Which is the American way of putting it. This is an
Okay.
American thought here, isn't it?
No. This is not an American thought. Oh, no. This is a global thought.
Oh, I know that.
This is a global thought. This is not an American thought.
Okay.
That's important. Now,
Back to the text.
Okay, good. That's what we like to hear. All right. Okay, this name is applied exclusively to God and is on that account called the Shem Ha-Meforash, the nomen proprium, the proper name. It is the distinct and exclusive designation of the divine being, whilst his other names are common nouns and are derived from actions to which some of our own are similar, as we have already explained. Now, I would comment on that as I'm going along, as I'm thinking, as I'm reading. Notice he's distinguishing not only the other names from this name as the names of God's actions as opposed to his proper name, okay? But also notice the other names are common nouns, whereas what he's saying in effect is this is a personal name, right? This is a specific name, or if I use the parlance of the thinking now occurring, this is the name of God as a particular, or as a person would be the implications. It's his personal name, his proper name, right? What's your proper name, you say? So it's, in that sense, relevant to what we're doing. And as we have already explained, the derivation of the name is not positively known, the word having no additional signification. This sacred name, which, as you know, was not pronounced except in the sanctuary by the appointed priests when they gave the sacerdotal blessing, and by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Now, of course, that's all obviously very relevant to the the focus of this chapter, right? The thinking now occurring in this chapter is being described as the understanding of existence as the new atonement, right? In the context of atonement, and therefore it's not accidentally that I have chosen this text from Maimonides, who's associating if I put this in a Hegelian way, in the pre-creation context in which God is, he is there together with his name, right? So the name pre-exists the creation, you see? And so, and that it's a name which in Hebrew, Hebrew piety, is not allowed to be pronounced, you see, and will not be pronounced at this point in history in a pious conservative understanding, certainly, until the temple is rebuilt and the high priest is reinstalled, you see, and at that time, and not before then, will the name actually be able to be pronounced in Hebrew. So there's a certain sense in which I think even Maimonides probably doesn't claim to know how it should be pronounced, right? It's already a problem at that point. Undoubtedly denotes something which is peculiar to God and is not found in any other being. It is possible that in the Hebrew language, of which we now have but a slight knowledge, the tetragrammaton, in the way it was pronounced, conveyed the meaning of absolute existence. And I think modern scholarship would say that's pretty good in terms of its root or etymological meaning. That's as good an understanding of its meaning. So the absolute existence, of course, we use that term in the thinking now occurring, right? What's being said here is, in a Christian-rooted thinking, in an incarnationally rooted thinking, is that absolute existence now, for the first time, is able to be understood as existing, right? Just say absolute existence exists is a way of phrasing that bridges the Maimonides' understanding of the name of Yahweh. It bridges that and let's say the notion of the incarnation, in which, in some sense, theologically, God is understood to have come into existence, right? Come to be as a creature. All right. So, but on this point, by the way, Maimonides is about a century before Thomas. So, if you have the notion that Thomas Aquinas is doing his thing in the 13th century, then Maimonides, we're going to locate him about 100 years before in the 12th century, and Maimonides would be one of the authorities, as it were, for Thomas philosophically, right? Not that I say authority, not necessarily agrees with him on everything, but he certainly knows Maimonides, and therefore the analog in Thomas of Yahweh translated by Maimonides as absolute existence is the phrase that we were dealing with last time, ipsum esse, being itself, would be Thomas's metaphysical, as it were, rendition of the notion of absolute existence. Right? Now, it's going to have a significance intellectually and metaphysically in Thomas that it doesn't have in Maimonides, because they're doing somewhat different things, but not unrelated. Right? Not unrelated, and it's not just an accident, is what I'm saying. In other words, the influence of Maimonides on Thomas would have been real. The frequent use of names of God derived from actions led to the belief that he had as many essential attributes as there were actions from which the names were derived. The following promise was therefore made, implying that mankind will at a certain future time understand this subject, maybe now, and be free from the error it involves. In that day will the Lord be one, and his name one. The meaning of this prophecy is this: he being one will then be called by one name, which will indicate the essence of God. But it does not mean that his sole name will be a derivative, that is one. All right. So notice further, Maimonides associates the notion of the name of God, the proper name of God, existing together with God from all eternity, as it were. Right. He associates that with the notion of the essence of God. Right. Again, in terms of the thinking now occurring, that's quite relevant. Okay, because in other words, translating the notion of the second person or the Word, to say that becomes incarnate, translating that into the metaphysical language of the thinking now occurring. I use metaphysical language loosely here because this is a metaphysics that is not metaphysical. It's a metaphysics that is indistinguishable from physics, right? That has become physical. But what traditionally would be understood as a kind of metaphysical way of speaking, essence, okay? That logos, the word, the second person, you say, in the thinking now occurring, is the essence of God. All right. So in effect, yeah.
Logos as name.
Yeah, exactly.
So the name
That's
of
right.
the Father is the Son.
The name of the Father is the Son. Yeah, I would have no problem with that.
Okay.
But when I say I have no problem with it, I have to be very careful not to fall. I would have a problem with it in the way Hegel would read that statement you just made. I would have a problem with that. I would have a problem, in other words, with an is that collapsed it in a non-Trinitarian way, okay? But in the sense that creates the problem that Jim was playing with last time, in the sense that the Son is neither greater nor less than the Father, and therefore that the Son is equal to the Father. Depending on how we're using the language, the Son is the Father not qua Father, but qua essence, qua divine being, qua one, qua unity, yes, right? The problem with the Trinitarian notion is that you can't take it, you can't simplify the simplicity into a simple unity. So if the difference between the notion that God, the unity of God, and the notion of the simplicity of God, as I pointed out in Augustine, is related to the notion of the Trinity, then a simplified simplicity takes us back to an undifferentiated unum, right? And even Maimonides, in his own context, is at pains to point out that the name of God is not to be reduced to what he calls a derivative. The name of God is not simply that he is one. You see, he has a proper name. He has a personal name. That's what Maimonides wants to say. Not a derivative, not a name that could be applied. See, one could be applied to any number of things, you could pardon the expression, right? But God's name is such that he has a unique name, to say. And in that sense, he is his name, or his name is him, in the sense, or is he, right? In the sense that it belongs, as he says, to no other. It's peculiar. It belongs to no other person, in a sense which, by the way, is not true of us. I mean, my name is Dave, and I think probably there are no other Daves in the room, right? But I'm certainly not the only Dave, okay? So now imagine that you had a name. People are always trying to do this. Parents love to try and, some parents like to do this perversely, right? Come up with a name that no one else has. Then, of course, they're chagrined to find out somebody else thought of it too, right? All right. But that's the...
It's a shame David Letterman is not called David Numberman.
That's true, right? But you might send him an email about that. But now take that notion here of naming, you see. The ideal, in some sense, right? I mean, we've adjusted to the fact that we're not the only Dave or the only Chuck or the only Jim and the only... You're luckier here in this country, right? Yeah, I was going to say. Right?
I'm unique.
Yeah, but back home, so to speak, you would not be so unique, right? Okay. But what my sense is that what we're looking for in the name, right, is a kind of uniqueness, right? Because we have the intuition that I think, that the person is unique. And wouldn't it be great if you could have a name that actually, as it were, captured your uniqueness? Well, once you start down that track, you understand what Augustine's talking about in the Trinity, right? God is able to create the image of himself that actually captures fully, and in the language of Maimonides, peculiarly, in all its specificity, uniqueness, his being. Do you see? Okay, so, all right, that's enough of that. So now all right, so, yes, I want to associate here, and yes, so Chuck's question is relevant because I'm in effect, if it is, I don't know how fully explicit it is, but I'm in effect, certainly, and probably explicitly somewhere along the line, I'm identifying Maimonides' understanding of the name with the Logos in the Trinitarian context. I'm not attributing a Trinitarian understanding to Maimonides, but I am pointing out that even Maimonides has, in a non-Trinitarian context, he has a notion of some kind of distinction in the divine being, you say, between God and his name that is in some sense for him real, you say, and peculiar and unique, right, and specific. Okay. Now, All right. Now, the next passage from Maimonides, which is on 363, he's doing a little more. Oh, well, before we get to that, on 362, I take advantage again now of this developing mathematical linguistic reading of the Hebrew. Right? You have to understand. I'm taking this one step at a time, and I'm writing this chapter. Right? I'm beginning to take advantage of what will become kind of full blown later on in this chapter. Then we'll have a relief. By the way, we have a couple of chapters that have none of this stuff in it, and then we come back to a very important chapter which has a lot of it in it again. Okay, so here I'm kind of feeling my way into this, and what I noted was there on page 362, in the bottom paragraph, the thinking now occurring for the first time essentially deciphers the cipher of the name in the form of the minimum. And by the way, in today's assignment, if you read it carefully, in that toward the end of the footnote, toward the end of the assignment, the linguistic mathematical reading of the Hebrew is applied to the Hebrew to decipher a manuscript. Okay, so that this thing kind of confirms itself internally as we go along. But here I'm just going on a kind of intellectual intuition, and I say that the essentially deciphers the cipher of the name in the form of the minimum. If the minimum qua proportion, and now I'm going back to the logical, what I call the logical chapter 3.1, which we were just looking at in terms of the rotation of the cornerstone, 4, 1, 2, 3. So if you take that as the minimum order, which I label it, right, and then its rational product is 2.66, right? So in other words, 4 over 1 times 2 over 3 gives you 2 2/3, 2.666. And if that minimum order is the foundational order of the trinary logic, or in the context of the trinary logic, better way it might be putting it. Now, taking strict care to avoid the arbitrary combination of letters. All right, so in other words, another distinction that the methodology of the thinking now occurring is not only fundamentally that the mathematical reading is a series of ratios which will form a proportion, but also in the thinking now occurring, there's no substitution allowed, so to speak, which is not true generally in gematria historically. No substitution of one letter for another in order, as it were, to get the desired result. Right? So there is, at least in principle, an eschewing of arbitrary moves. All right? So you have to take the text, as it were, as it lies. Okay? So without manipulating the text at all, which Maimonides rightly complains of in his warning against the magical use of Holy Scripture, but also leaving behind the arbitrariness of negative theology, taken with that of its heir, the mystical modern philosophy, let it be noted that Torah, in the Hebrew, law, qua proportion of the numerical value of the letters, 4 is to 6 is 200 is to 5, the rational product of that is 2.66 times 10 to the third. All right. So what we have there in scientific notation is a coincidence between the rational product of the minimum order, the logic, and the rational product of the Hebrew for law or Torah, with the qualification that in the Hebrew it's times 10 to the third, right? In other words, you have a certain number of zeros by which, or a certain number of zeros by which it is multiplied. It thus appears that the minimum is the little Torah. So I'm now kind of a little playful here, right? Indeed, identically the multiple. Now it turns out, just a coincidence, you understand. Turns out that the Hebrew word for 1,000, which is the difference between 2.66, the minimum rational product, and the Hebrew rational product is 1,000 times that, right? And it turns out that the rational product of 1,000 is 2.66, which is kind of neat, okay? By which it is the law, this minimum, this 1,000th part, qua substance, ever so lightly armed with this tiny bona fide credential of the perfect rationality of the law, this little Torah, and then it turns out, it's fun, see? This little David, David is the guy who slew Goliath. David is the king who ultimately builds the temple. Yeah?
David's the guy who blasphemes against.
Oh yeah. But it is of the house of David, Bethlehem, you see, from which the embodiment of the incarnation is descended. All right. So the theological and historical resonance there. It turns out that David in Hebrew likewise, its identifying rational product, its identifying value, all right, is this same 2.66. This
Is there anything that isn't?
Yes, of course. This essentially rational measure, the minimum, sets out to rationally unify the name of the one God. And then I quote Maimonides. Moses comes in, but we'll pick him up a little bit later, because this passage is about Moses. And dropping down about 10 lines in 363, then God taught Moses how to teach them and how to establish amongst them the belief in the existence of himself, namely by saying, Eya, Asha, Eya, a name derived from the verb haya, in the sense of existing, for the verb. And notice, so now you have Yahweh, which Maimonides is associating with the notion of existence or being in the Hebrew. And by the way, I think it's in this passage somewhere, he points out that in Hebrew, being and existence are not really distinguished. Okay? So in this context, take it as you will, being or existence, or the ipsum esse of Thomas Aquinas, right, is rooted in the identical notion of being as both Yahweh, the proper name of God, and God's way of identifying himself to Moses for the benefit of the people as I am that am, I am who am, or he might have said you could translate it, I exist as he who exists, right? My existence is my existence, right? Something to that effect, right? I am my existence. It's the root idea of that and I think I mentioned this briefly last time. We had to drop it because of time. It's also the notion in Maimonides of what Augustine would call Augustine would want to erase the distinction of subject and predicate, but Maimonides puts it the other way around, right? That I am who am is effectively saying that the subject and the attribute are identical. Okay, that's the way Maimonides would put it, but it comes to the same thing. In other words, in God there is no real distinction between who God is, as it were, and what God is. God is who he, right? What God is who he is, or vice versa, is the basic notion.
So if you take it that, for the moment, the English distinction between being and existence is the existence between a whatness and a factuality. If you say that distinction, I mean, there are lots of ways of
being in existence as a whatness and a factuality.
The being of something is what it
like
is.
The whatness.
The existence of something is the fact that it is.
Okay.
All right. So you're saying that the I am that I am means that the I am in the sense of that the whatness that I have is my existence. My whatness and my existence.
Yes, except that I just want to be careful not to confuse things. I'm not saying that this is what Maimonides is saying. Maimonides is denying that in the Hebrew there's a distinction between.
But what is this? What is he saying here? Because I can't figure out what he's saying.
All right. Well, let's read a little further.
He gives this Arabic word.
Ilati, I think. Where is that? Ilati. It's just
He says it's a noun, but an incomplete noun.
An incomplete noun, right. Well, that's his terminology.
The word asher, that, corresponds to the Arabic iladi and ilati, and is an incomplete noun that must be completed by another noun.
Right. So it has some kind of conjunction or force, right? In other words,
but he says it may be considered as the subject of the predicate that follows. So he's not saying that the first I am is the subject of the second I am as predicate. He's saying that, which of course in English is what always, when Billy Graham puts on a cow face and says, I am that I am 16 times, it's the word that's the problem.
Okay.
That gives it its force.
Okay.
So that's what I'm not clear what you think he's saying.
Well, I think we have two different issues going here. The first thing I was saying was that he says somewhere, if I could put my finger on it, that I think he says on this that the Hebrew doesn't distinguish between.
Yes, he does.
No,
He
yeah,
does, right?
Right above that.
Existence is to be. Yeah, right. Okay. So that was the first thing I was saying. Then I was generalizing. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. In other words, I was just making an analogy to Augustine's treatment of a similar issue when it comes to attributing something to God. That in the case of God, there is no real distinction for Augustine between subject and predicate, or substance and attribute. That's what I was doing. That's all I meant to do. Now, the point you're raising, if I'm hearing you correctly,
Well, the first, he says something
right.
first that is easy to understand.
Okay.
He says by saying ehia, asher, ehia, a name derived from the verb haya in the sense of existing, for the verb haya denotes to be, and in Hebrew no difference is made between the verbs to be and to exist. Now, he gets to say that because he's writing in Arabic.
okay, right.
The principal point in this phrase is that the same word which denotes existence is repeated as an attribute. And so that part we could follow.
Right. Okay.
The word asher, that, corresponds to the Arabic iladi and ilati, and is an incomplete noun that must be completed by another noun.
Okay.
It may be considered as the subject of the predicate follows.
All right.
So that sentence is what I don't.
Well, I mean,
The first noun which is to be described is.
well, what he says literally, right? It's an incomplete noun. Why he calls it a noun? I don't think in our grammar we wouldn't call that a noun. I think that's
Well,
one.
in our grammar, we wouldn't call it anything because it doesn't.
Well, there is a term for it. I'm not a grammarian. There is a.
You know that locution.
What
I
is
am
the
that I
term?
am is unique. There is no other.
It's a
use of-
relative. I think we would call it. I'm trying to remember my English grammar now. It's so
relative.
long. A relative. If it was who, if I am, but sometimes this is read I am who am. In which case, it would be clear in English you would call the who a relative pronoun.
Yeah, but that's
Correct?
not right. But the
Okay.
reason it's translated this way is because obviously something else is going on here. Who isn't what is doing it. So I'm trying to see, can we actually get closer to what's going on,
Okay, but
or
Okay.
does it matter? I mean, I'll give it up. If it
no,
doesn't matter.
I don't want you to give it up entirely because you're focusing on something that's interesting. I just don't want to. I don't want to get sidetracked. In other words, whether it's who or that, whatever ilati
No, I mean,
means
if-
or asher
In
means.
English, it would be who or which.
Well,
It would never be that.
Okay, fine.
But that and I think that in the King James version, which is probably where it actually was put in there,
Okay.
those guys were putting it in there because they wanted to point to something that was peculiar.
Fine. All I want here's my answer. My answer is whether asher should be translated as who, which, what, that. I don't. Right? It's some sort of a connective referring backwards to the first part of the phrase and connecting the first part of the phrase as such because it's a connector word,
Some kind of-
relative word. It's incomplete in and of itself. I think that's what Maimonides is saying. In other words, it's a relative word of some sort or another, which as such is incomplete. It has to be completed by a predicate, which is the second I am. So I am that I am who, what? I am which I am. All right? Okay. So in that sense, it's an incomplete relative pronoun or whatever you want to call it. It's incomplete because it's relative. In and of itself, it's incomplete. But it's completed by the repetition of the first part of the phrase, the I am. I think that's where he's at. Now, what is interesting to me, since you raised the issue, which I don't know whether this is where you were going or not, but it interests me in the light of my critique, my rejection of Heidegger's notion that existence cannot be captured. Do you remember that in our assignment somewhere? Heidegger makes the point, by quotation, that existence cannot be captured in a proposition, which is out and out denied by the thinking now occurring. But here I see in this little hang-up we have here something fruitful, right? Because, according to Maimonides' way of putting it, the fact, so we may not understand why he says it's a noun, because we would rather call it, I think, in our grammar, a relative pronoun of some sort, you see? But he calls it a noun and says it has to be completed by a predicate. Well, let's grant him, let's say he knows what he's talking about, even if we don't. Okay? Then what he's saying is that I am, right? The first I am is followed by a noun and a predicate. Maimonides' bottom line reading here, what this signifies, is that the existing he is the existing being which is the existing being. That's way, right, the way he's putting it. And there, by the way, in a very casual way, he puts in a which, right? Or he's speaking in the third person, but right. So which, that, who, that is to say, the being whose existence is absolute. Okay. Now, what you might say in the context of the thinking now occurring, I'll come to the specific question in a moment, because the next page will inevitably take us there. But again, backing up a little bit, the general conceptual thing is here that if I were to quote Maimonides, the being whose existence is absolute, if I didn't know the context, or if I didn't specify a context for that statement as it's written here in English on the page, then I could say that I could find that in a transcription of the thinking now occurring. Thinking now occurring has to do with a being whose existence is absolute. Do you see? All right, two things. One, in the context, being and existence are not, according to Maimonides, to be distinguished. Okay? So a being whose being is absolute, he might have written, with no reference to the later or modern distinction between being and existence as the difference between what is in a way that's indifferent to the question of time and eternity, and what is in the sense of being a spatio-temporal being, right, which is the modern sense of exist. Remember, I pointed out to you a good example of this is when a Peirce asks himself the question on behalf of some imaginary reader, do you believe, or would you say that God exists? And Peirce says to himself, well, not exactly. If you mean, not so much God exists, but if you mean is God real? Oh, no question about it for Peirce. God is real. But to exist, you say, comes to mean in the modern philosophical context, it means to be in time and space. You say, but Maimonides is denying such a distinction here substantively in terms of the significance of this phrase. So what I'm getting at is two ways so I'm saying a couple of things. That being absolutely exists for Maimonides doesn't have the same significance, if I can use that term. It doesn't specify the identical truth that the phrase does in the thinking now occurring, because in the thinking now occurring, the existence we're talking about is precisely incarnational, temporal, spatial existence in traditional terms. And the other thing that would be missing from the phrase taken out of context is that in the full context of thinking now occurring, you would have to include the notion of for the first time, right? So the notion of, and that would be, by the way, implicitly related to the distinction between a being which might be eternal and never have a beginning, and a world in which being means existence, where existence cannot really be distinguished from coming into being, having a beginning, right? In one way or another, depending on which philosophy you're talking about. Okay. Okay, but in any event, with those qualifications backwards, the being whose existence is absolute, the proof which he was to give consisted in demonstrating that there is a being of absolute existence that has never been and never will be without existence in this, what trans-temporal sense, right, or eternal sense, perhaps. All right, so now we come back to the logico-mathematical linguistic. They all get rolled into one here. On page 364, thus the minimum enunciates the absolute, save that now for the first time in history the proof form of the existence of God in the universe manifests itself ex abysso, and in light of the fact that the subject is nothing, is heard in the essence of the Dasein, as identically the essence of the minimum, as identified with the fundamental truth of the minimum, as follows. And then I try and explain in these terms what I mean, what I intend there, what I'm saying. Let the statement of the divine identity, be read now in this context mathematically as the proportion that follows there, be reduced in a form that preserves the syntax as described by Maimonides. So actually our little hang up there on the alati is productive here, is useful, because that's the break point, right? That's the beginning of that portion of the phrase. The incomplete noun, as he calls it, is the beginning of, as it were, of the second half of the phrase, which by itself, as incomplete noun, is incomplete and gets completed by the repetition of the I am, right? So I analyze, following Maimonides' analysis, his breakdown, as it were, of that little text. I set it up in terms of the mathematical methodology of the thinking now occurring. And so the I am, translated mathematically, right, is 1 over 5 times 2, right? So, and that I am is 2/3 times 1 over 5 times 2, because the 1 over 5 times 2, the second one is just the mathematical repetition of I am, okay? And then I reduce that, right? I mean, I just simplify it mathematically, and I get I am, right? 2 times 1/5 is 0.40, right? 4/10, okay? And that I am is 0.266. So now I've got my little Torah, I've got my David, I've got my Torah, I've got my minimum. See, I've got it here, and again a slight different inflection divided by 10. Okay, but I've got this structure here, and then what I do, and this will help me explode out and kill a few birds with one stone. Then I take the 0.4 and I say, well, okay, that's literally true. I mean, in other words, the mathematics gives you 0.40 equals 2.66. But if I want to raise that to the level of unity, right, that's the equivalent of 1 equals 2/3. Okay. Now, why bother? Okay. All right. Let me. I got a couple of things I want to do here. Let me stick to the linguistic aspect of it a moment. So I say, having done that, here is the literally and perfectly rational identification of the fundamental truth of the minimum. So now I'm identifying. So I'm saying, this is really neat, because 1 equals 2/3, which is what this phrase is, syntactically described by Maimonides, translated in the methodology of the mathematical linguistic thinking now occurring, is the equivalent, reduces to, in some sense, 1 equals 2/3. And I'm saying, that's neat, because I'm alleging here that's the fundamental truth of the minimum, 1 equals 2/3. And there would be a footnote that would take us back to 274 and 287. So let's take a look at, maybe quickly, at the first and then the second. Now we're back to this diagram again. See, so I guess what I'm trying to do, by way, among other things, not only am I trying to explicate this text, but I'm also trying to encourage you that it hangs together in a way which may not be obvious, right? It's rather...
I have to tell you, I was confused. I was wondering why you're raising 1 equals 2/3 to the 22nd power. But I'm glad you straightened this out.
Yeah. Footnote 22, right. That's a good point, though. I don't know how you would avoid that. There must be some trick. Yeah, you're right. That's interesting. Although now you see, I'm so crazy that I'm tempted to get out my calculator.
We all know you're crazy.
See what the 22nd power is, right? Okay. So now
you'll do that, searching it out.
Well, I actually have my calculator here, but I'm just restraining myself.
Okay.
So on page 274, the reference back to 274, which is in footnote 21, because 22 is an ibid. Underneath, it's the same. All right, so we've got the same analysis going on about the cornerstone, the fourfold rotation of the cornerstone, which is described here on top of 274. And underneath it, I say, in this transformation of the fundamental order, appearance 2, right? In other words, meaning the second, right? The second in order, and essence 3 exchange material identities, right? By which I mean, as you see on the translation of the left-hand column above it there, translates 4 into 1, 1 into 2, 2 into 4, and 3 into 3. But the material identities, if you were to analyze the direction of the arrows over against, let me see if I can do that quickly. Get back to the first appearance of those I don't know whether I'm going to be able to do this quickly. I don't want to think it through, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to just take my word for it. Maybe I'll write it out for you. But the bottom line is that in this analysis, on page 274, there is a identification of the material values of 2 and 3 in the earlier analysis. And then on page 287 and following, there is the analysis of the difference between Peirce's version of a trichotomic mathematics, a 3-part mathematics, and his assertion that it is a 2 times 3 affair at simplest there on page 287. And the reason I go through this analysis is that I'm trying to point out and in fact demonstrate that in the thinking now occurring as over against Peirce's triad, there is a real trinary logic where each of the 3 elements, in the case of the real trinary logic, the 0, unum, and 1, are equal, or where thirdness is an absolute like firstness and secondness in Peirce. And I'm using his text and the analysis of his text to show visually, as it were, and logically, how that one way in which that can be understood. So, and it's relevant to the Maimonides transcription. So why don't you think that? Pass. I got more than we need here. Yeah, if you would just pass it.
364.
Say again.
You're going to leave page 364?
Well, we don't. Well, what'd you have on 360?
I just have in the
364. Oh, you're back. No, we're going back to that. We're definitely going back to that. But go on. What do you want to ask me?
Well, I just want to ask you in the paragraph beginning the word here.
Here is the literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Running down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. You have a close quote there. Where's the opening of that?
No. That's a Hebrew. That's a Hebrew word for God.
Yeah.
Yud.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Right. That's another one of those things that we can on the same page. We have a footnote that looks like an exponent, and we have a name of God in Hebrew that looks like a close quote.
Okay.
Okay. But notice, by the way, since you called our attention to that, the reason that's quoted there, that name of God, is that its rational product is 2/3. Okay? So we're finding in the Hebrew the name of God where the identity factor, as opposed to the absolute factor, the rational product as opposed to the integral product, is 2/3. That's fitting in with the analysis of the Maimonides text, reduced in the context of the mathematical linguistics of thinking now occurring. But now the reason I'm going back to the logical chapters is that I want to show that this is deeply woven into the logical analysis before any reference either to Maimonides or to the Hebrew name for the Yud, the Hebrew name for God, whose rational product is going to give us. I'm sorry, I got the wrong one. It's Adonai, right? Which gives us the rational product as 2/3. So now, so I just
No. It's, when you have, isn't it? No, maybe.
No.
The 2 yuds are what's printed, rather than writing out Adonai, which stands for Yod He Vav He. So what happens is you say Adonai when Yod He Vav He, but you write Yud. Okay.
But I think I'm still wrong. I mean, you may be right, but I may be wrong here. In other words, it's the name that gives us 2/3.
Hashem,
it's the name.
Hashem is is one way of writing Yod He Vav He.
Yeah. Okay.
Yod is another way.
I understand.
When you see either of them, you say Adonai.
Okay. So all right. That's helpful. So since we're on this page again, 364, momentarily, to try and clarify all of that, clear that up.
Can I just ask one other thing? I'm sorry, it's very fundamental here, I think.
All right.
In the Hebrew, Yud, the the second one comes first. Is that right? I mean,
That's
you're
correct.
reading
Hebrew
from
is
right to
written
left, right?
right to left. Correct.
Yeah. So when you do your
Math, I'm doing it right to left, even though I'm writing it left to right in English. So the numbers are left to right, but they correspond to the right to left order of the Hebrew.
Well,
Okay.
Very glad to hear that.
All right, and Hashem, which is all right. So what's happening here? Just to clarify this, is that the Yud, its rational product is 1, and as Chuck is pointing out, Hashem, which is substituted for that, or maybe substituted in the context.
Can I explain it just quite simply?
All right.
You have this problem. You're not allowed to pronounce Yod He Vav He in any way. You're also not allowed to write it. So instead of whenever it would come up in the text where it should be Yod He Vav He, you get Yud Yud. But you don't usually say Yud Yud either. You say Hashem, which means the name. So Yud Yud, Hashem, Yod He Vav He are all actually interchangeable. And sometimes when you're reading it, if somebody was actually saying it in a prayer, they would say Adonai, which means the Lord. And so all the English prayers would say the Lord are just substitutes for what would be Yod He Vav He, might be written Yud Yud or written as Hashem.
And in this context, on that page, the Hebrew then is saying qua identities, rational products of these two words that are used interchangeably, 1 equals 2/3. The rational product of Adonai, Yud Yud, and the rational product of Hashem, 1 is 1 and 1 is 2/3. And they're used interchangeably, you see, as substitutes for the unspeakable name of God. Right? So that's why they're there. But now I want to go back to the logical thing, which is a little more complicated, and try and give a simplified version of that. And on page 291, Peirce is sets up an analysis of what he calls 2 sets of 3 things on page 291. And so he's got 3 things, 2 sets of 3 things. RST is 1 set of 3 things, and OPQ is another set. And then in that little line there with where he draws lines between them there on the top half of the page, right? He gets these 6 different patterns. So these are 6 different ways of relating 2 sets of 3 things, okay? And then he puts them. Remember, we distinguished the thinking now occurring logical box from other Hegelian or quantum physics 3-valued logics as not being derived from any external multiplication, right? Because there's an infinite lattice work, and you can't. The outside of existence is existence. The outside of this box is the outside of this box. Right, you see, so there's no place from without that you can constitute it. But Peirce is not in the world of thinking now occurring, so his natural instinct, which is very common in any kind of normal logic, right? You might say ordinary logic, is to relate these 6 different results by relating 2 sets of 3 things, to put them in boxes, and you'll notice he puts them in boxes where the results that he gets up there correspond to the external multiplication. Do you see? So now here's the point. In order to do that, all right, following the external rules of external multiplication, he's got 6 results, but he can't get them in 1 box. I mean, to put it really crudely, he needs 2 boxes. Well, you can say he could put them in. Yeah, but sure he could. But then he'd have to have 2 results in each square. You see what I'm saying? In other words, so he's just set it up neatly here. You could say, well, he could get them in there if he made his boxes bigger. He could put the results in the right-hand box. He could squeeze them in their appropriate slot in the left-hand box. You see what I'm saying? But if he did that, then he'd have, instead of having 9 things in his box, he'd have 18. So he's still got 18. It's neater to put them in 2 different boxes. It's clearer. You got it? That's what he does. Now, what I'm doing on the handout, I'm doing very cryptically on page 293. So if you read page 293, dropping down, dropping down 7 or 8 lines on page 293, I say, following so far, in other words, with a certain qualification, following so far Peirce's procedure, the 9 double sets All right, now what have I done? Up above, I've said, all right, let's use Peirce's procedure, 2 sets of 3 things. And as far as Peirce goes, I'm going to get, on the previous page there, on page 291, I'm going to get two doubles, right? Two double sets of what do I say here? 9? Yeah, 9 double sets is what I call it, okay? But now, substituting for his what? For his RST, for his PQ, OPQ, whatever it is, PO. Substituting, in other words, for his essentially indifferent letters. You understand? In other words, these are pure. You talk about arbitrary, okay? These letters are just arbitrary designations of anything whatsoever. So let's substitute, instead of 2 sets of 3 things arbitrarily defined as RST and OPQ or whatever it is, let's substitute the logical digits, which are not understood to be arbitrary designations at all, right? But if anything, are each of them absolutely specific, you see, in terms of an absolutely specified unity, okay, which is the logical unity. Let's do the same procedure using the logical digits. When I do the same procedure using the logical digits, and now you can look at the handout, I guess. You got to put the colored part at the bottom of the page. I don't know whether that's crystal clear. Okay.
I had it the other way.
Yeah, well, I did too, so that's why I'm saying it. That's why I'm saying it. All right. So, up at the top of the handout, I'm doing exactly the same thing procedure-wise as he does with his indifferent, arbitrary RSTs and Ps and Qs and so forth. I'm using now the intrinsically intelligible logical digits, and I'm going so far, I'm playing his game, I'm putting them, as he does, in 2 boxes, do you see? But when I put them in the 2 boxes, I can now put them, here's the point, it's really simple. I said he could put his 2 boxes in 1 box, it'll be a little crowded, each square would have 2 results in it, you see? But because I'm using the logical digits, I can put what at the first move are the 2 sets of results. I can put them in the 1 box by relating the sets logically to one another, reducing them, in other words, logically to 1. Right? So I can get in the 1 box, right, the 9. I can reduce his 18 to 9 logically, which he cannot do. Right? Now, the further implication of that, which is going to take us back to the analysis of the Maimonidean text and the fundamental notion that's otherwise dealt with at that part of the text, illustrated here by the penultimate box on the handout page, where the bottom 3 squares are grayed in the text on page 293. That corresponds to the text pointing out that when I do the simplification, when I reduce the 9 double sets to, not to 1 double set, to 1 set of 9. That'd be a better way of putting it. When I go, this is good. This is also relevant to today's reading and to the analysis of how Altizer is in the Peircean tradition. We mentioned this tangentially last time. It's much more elaborate in today's assignment, that for Altizer, self-identity is self-doubling identity, right? And so the doubling that Altizer speaks about theologically, the self-doubling identity and the self-negating of the primordial Godhead that empties itself out and becomes what we say, where voice or speech empties itself out in a silence, which silence is the embodiment of speech. The theological way of putting that, which he puts in his 90s works, is that much more clearly that when God negates himself in the creation of the world, when God falls in such a way as to cease to be what he had been, he becomes, in Altizer's language, which is repeated here in his speech quotation, he becomes his own other, right? He becomes his own other, or his own otherness. Analogously, in his speech silence thing, speech becomes its own silence. Do you see? So the doubling there, the self-identity is really intrinsically a double identity. Well, Altizer didn't invent this idea that self-identity is a double identity. You see, it's already the seeds of it are there in Hegel. You see, but it becomes explicit in Peirce, who slows the Hegelian film down, who prevents the Hegelian trinity from ever being simplified to a totally undifferentiated unity, who introduces into Peirce, read American pragmatism, read the penultimate form of thinking, penultimate to the global universal thinking of the thinking now occurring, when American consciousness, in the form of Peirce's logic and his pragmatism, when it introduces some kind of difference into the undifferentiated unity of Hegel, which Peirce complains about profoundly, you see, when it doesn't introduce what I call an absolute differentiation, an absolute difference. It introduces a difference in the form of a self-doubling, a double. Yeah, you see, it introduces a kind of difference, but it gives with one hand, it takes away with the other, right? It's a doubling. It's not a Trinitarian difference. It's not an absolute differentiation of the persons, an absolute difference of the digits, you see. And so the self-doubling that appears in the theology of Althuiser's reading, you see, it's rooted in Peirce, and that's what I'm demonstrating here in a very abstract way. I mean, I'm following Peirce. I'm doing his game, playing his game, and I'm saying that not only can I get one set of 9 I can reduce the 2 sets of 9 to 1 because of the logical relations of what are not undifferentiated somethings or other, undifferentiated unities, RST, etc., because they're intelligible in and of themselves, and they have an intelligible relationship to one another. You see, they are with one another in a essential way in the structure of the logic. I can reduce them to one set, and then further, right? I now have them. I have the 9 in the cornerstone. This is just the cornerstone stood on end, right, as a diamond type shape, right? I've now got them in the form that corresponds to the cornerstone, and I notice on page 293 and here illustrated that of that 9, 3 are, you might call them, redundant, right? In other words, I can reduce the set of 9 to 6. In other words, of the 9, when it comes to being different from one another, if I can put it that way, when I'm focused on the difference, the 9 reduces to 6. There are 6 different among the 9. Right? So there's my 2/3. Okay? In other words, in the very structure of the logical analysis of the relationship between 2 sets of 3s, you see, I ultimately simplify the situation so that I don't have a doubling situation, right? I don't have 2 in one box. I get rid of the doubling aspect of this reduction, and at the same time, the elimination of the doubling aspect of the identity factors here coincides the identification of that unity with a 2/3 value. You see, and then I just put on here afterwards. This is not mentioned explicitly at that point in the text. The bottom colored thing is to show you the cornerstone. How the cornerstone, taken pure and simple, originally, you see, can be, in terms of the logic, reduced to 6 values. You see, if I
don't follow that.
You didn't follow that
Yeah,
one.
how do you
Okay.
get from
Well,
the
because the
how do you
0.
reduce?
Huh?
There's only 3 different symbols, so that's not what you're saying. So what are the 6 things that are different?
Because in the logic, a 0 and a unum give me a 1.
Mm-hmm.
And I have in the cornerstone, it could be done a slightly different way, but I did it this way for simplicity's sake. In other words, so what I have here is,
unum and 0.
I have the equivalent of 6 1s. Do you see that? Take each, you got 3 sets of 0 unums, so I can reduce them logically to 3 1s.
Yeah.
And I've already got 3 1s. Now, logically, I can reduce the 9 digits to 3 1s.
Right.
Okay, so that, go back to the notion of the arithmetic transcription possibility, so that I can forget the arithmetic. So I can reduce the 9 digits to 6 within the cornerstone.
6 what?
6 ones.
6 ones. Oh, okay.
Because of the unum.
Yeah.
because unum and
Okay,
zero.
I got that.
Okay.
Good.
All right. So what I'm saying is that originally in the internal structure of the cornerstone, there is a two-thirdness quality. Do you see?
Yeah.
Which is reflected in the application of the logical values to Peirce's procedure. So he comes out. All right. Now here's what I want to do.
Wait, can I?
Yeah, yeah.
The procedure is on page 291, right?
Yeah.
And this is a procedure whereby two sets of three things,
Correct.
right, are
Correspond to one another in 6 ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, when you, he's got two sets of three different things. If we don't know how they are different, but they are certainly different.
Correct.
R, S, and T are different from O, P, and Q.
Correct.
Now, why is it that what you're proclaiming here isn't associated with you simply instead of taking R, S, and T, you put the
0,
same
1, and
numbers
1, I
on
guess,
top
right?
of each other. I mean, instead of R, S, T, O, P, Q,
Right.
all
Right.
Vertically related
Correct.
separately, you take the same things and relate them vertically, don't you? I mean, if I take this piece of paper here,
When you say the same things, what do you mean?
well, you have 0, unum, and 1 related to 0, unum, and 1
Correct.
vertically.
Correct.
He has R, S, and T related to O, P, and Q.
Okay. Well, you want me to? Well, okay. I understand your objection. I think I do.
Yeah.
And
I mean, no wonder he's got to come up with.
would you be? Well, let me ask you
double
this.
the number of squares that you do.
Let me
but
ask you
he's-
this.
yeah.
Let me ask you this.
Go ahead.
You don't like you're objecting to the fact that my bottom set looks the same as the top set.
Yeah.
Okay. Would it satisfy your objection if I reordered the bottom set? In other words, I left the top set 0, unum, 1, and I made the bottom set 1, 1, 0, unum.
Well, it wouldn't bother me, but I think it might bother Peirce. I mean, he's talking about 6 things, and you're talking about 3 things.
Yours is self-referenced. Yours is self-related. You've got the 3 things related to themselves. You've got the 3 things related to another set of
2
3.
sets of 3 things, he says.
Yeah, and he's
Okay.
got
You've
one
got
set of
2
3
sets
things.
of. You've got
Yeah, okay.
2 repetitions of 3 things.
Okay. So I'm saying, would it make any? If I change the order? In other words, in the logic, there's nothing beyond 0, unum, and 1. There's no.
Well, that's
There's
fine.
no other set logically to bring in.
Right, no problem.
Okay, so the best
but,
I
but I don't think you're helping Peirce out with this. You're simply transcending Peirce.
Well, okay, I'm not trying to help him out.
Well, you're trying to
the,
say
the purpose of this is not to help him out. It's to show.
Look, Peirce, if you did it my way, you could save yourself a box here.
That's true. That's true. I am, but not literally. That is, there's no way that it would occur to Peirce to do it my way, as you put it, because he has no concept of the real trinary logic. All I'm trying to point out is the difference between what he's doing. Right? He's able to have what you're identifying as 2 sets of. It's hard to get the language for
2
this.
sets of the same things.
2 sets of. Okay, 2 different sets of 3 things. I guess that's what you want to do. Yeah, 2 different sets of 3 things. Okay, I'm saying the reason he thinks that the fundamental question that he's dealing with is solved by relating 2 different sets of 3 things. Mm-hmm. Is a corollary of the fact that, number one, he has no notion of a real trinary logic. He has no notion of a set of 3 things that contains within itself intrinsic difference in the relationship of the 3 things. Right? On the based analogously on the Trinitarian notion, not based on it, but analogous to what we're talking about in Augustine. He's got 2 different sets of 3 things, but no thing in either of those 2 different sets of 3 things is anything but a blank. He's got 2 sets. The there's no intrinsic differentiation to the things. The differentiation is purely external. It's in the different form of the letters. It's not in the relationships. He could have picked MNO and Z to make the same. You see what I'm saying? So if you want to say, I mean, I'm trying to
Help me out.
I'm not trying to help you out. I'm trying to bridge your objection to what I'm trying to get at. If the things you're dealing with have no intrinsic specificity, right? In other words, if the here's where I was going to try and bridge it. If the difference between the things you're talking about is external, simply external, then you have Peirce's procedure. But if the logical procedure does not admit of any kind of externality to its, as it were, inner workings, then you have the logic in which there is nothing beyond the three. I'm trying to get at the notion that there's nothing beyond the three digits in trying to read logic, because they contain within themselves all the difference that, as it were, would be necessary.
Well, we're back to the tautological aspect.
Okay, yes, but as far as that phrase goes, which I think appears in Novitas Mundi, right? Yeah. Okay. The distinction there is made between the formally tautological and, well, listen.
I know that, but I mean...
Well, no, I'm sorry. I have to insist on this. You can dismiss it, but you can't dismiss it and preserve your argument. In other words, the thinking now occurring takes seriously the distinction between the formally tautological and an essentially tautological. Because an essentially tautological reality is productive, it's creative.
No, but this book could be a lot flatter if you took this out of here. And it could be a lot truer to... Because I don't see what it... I mean, I don't know
what don't you see?
I don't see what's the point of all this. You're setting up a straw man here where you say, hey, this guy doesn't understand reality, so let's take his misunderstanding of reality. Well, you can have a million of these.
I wish you wouldn't paraphrase my characterization of Peirce. He understands reality.
Well, he doesn't understand... Well,
he could not possibly understand a reality which is now, for the first time in history, understandable.
Okay, well that's what I was saying.
Well,
I apologize.
Well, it has a different connotation to say he doesn't understand reality.
Well, no, I don't mean he was crazy. I'm just saying that I'm repeating what you're saying, namely that because this is all in the past, if you will, and because it precedes the thinking now occurring for the first time.
Right.
The poor Peirce here, he thought he was working with something else. He thought he was working with a world where you could have 6 or 12 or some other number of essential realities, right?
No.
But
this is purely arbitrary.
All you have is 3 things, if you will, as opposed to 6 or some other number.
Correct.
And we put them down, and suddenly the 2 boxes merge. But I don't know where. I'd really like to know if somebody who really knows math thinks that this, or set theory, thinks that this says anything. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't move anywhere for me. It sets up Peirce as a man of the past and convicts him by applying to his math something he wasn't even thinking about. So what? I mean, that's true of just about everything. And that's the ultimate formal, essential, whatever you want to call it, tautology of this whole thinking. To say, you could take this whole book and reduce it, the way you have the universe, down to something very minimal. But the book itself continues to set up these very elaborate straw men and knock them down.
Well, I don't know why you call it a straw man.
Well, maybe it probably only bothers me.
At some point.
Yeah. Well, you put it on the forum till the cows come home, but it doesn't change the essence of my point. So let's move on in the text then. All right.
Please. move on.
All right.
That's the important thing to get through this book. Go ahead.
All right. So, just to summarize, in the context of the thinking now occurring, what is demonstrated here in the thinking now occurring is that put it in bold mathematical terms, unity equals 2/3 in. All right, so I need to correct something literally in the text on page 365, which is the next page that led us backwards. All right, go back to where we were after Maimonides on page 365, just about 11 lines up from the bottom of page 365, I believe it's 11 lines, where it says 2 equals 2 times 3. All right, that's at least a typo. It's been so long since I put it together there. I don't know whether it was a typo at the time or not, but it's a typo. It's a mistake, and it should read 1 equals 2/3. Okay, and so now on this same topic, if we all right. So having made that correction, and then back up on the page 365. To about a third of the way down the page, where toward the end of the page it says, "This proof is the evidence of absolute love, of the absolute identification of the divine with existence here and now, at once the logical manifestation of the Trinity as the Almighty and His name, of the three as the two, identically the unity of the three irreducible to unity, identically the unity of three absolute unities, which I then characterize in mathematical terms as 2 equals 1 times 3. But you recognize, of course, that 2 equals 1 times 3 is just a transcription or a transposition of 1 equals 2/3. Do you see that? Okay, so it's just turning the fractional expression 1 equals 2/3 into 2 equals 1/3. Right? So I'm saying in the thinking now occurring, 2 equals 1/3, 1 times 3, pardon me, 2 equals 1 times 3 is to say that put it in the Maimonides context a moment, without convicting Maimonides of anything. All right? This is not the point of convicting Maimonides of the past. We're not convicting the past. We're saying Maimonides sees and makes a point that before the creation there is the Almighty and His name. He makes a point of distinguishing the I am from what I'm calling here in a post-Heideggerian context, the propositional form of the incomplete noun, and the I am, the that I am, the who I am, the which I am. All right. So Maimonides has a notion of, if I put it abstractly, he has a notion of some kind of difference, right? Some kind of two-ness, if I can put it that way, you see. But the incarnational notion, the Augustinian notion, the Trinitarian notion, is that what is 2 is understood to be 3, right? So where I have the Almighty and His name in Maimonidean terms, you see, where I have now notice this is not irrelevant to Hegel, and it's not irrelevant to Peirce, where I have in Hegel, for example, the Father and the Son, and I don't have a real 3, then the Father and the Son get collapsed into one another. Do you see? Or in Peirce, who was already introduced what I've now identified as a differentiation into an undifferentiated Hegelian, and ultimately, I have to be careful here, we're talking about bottom line. From Peirce's point of view, the bottom line in Hegel is an ultimately undifferentiated unity. So Peirce slows that down and refuses to allow the 3 moments to be reduced ultimately to 1. He insists that they must remain apart, and so he introduces an irreducible difference of some sort into unity, which is missing in Hegel. The form of that some kind of differentiation that he introduces The point of all of this jazz, all right, is not to convict Peirce of anything. It's to say he made an advance on Hegel. He introduced difference into unity, but the form of the difference was a doubling form. Right? Do you see? He right. The two was a doubling of one's. Right. It reappears in Altice's theology. Okay. And so the point here is to say that in the thinking now occurring, just in the bold terms, 2 equals 1 times 3. 2, in Maimonidean terms, the Almighty and His name. In Hegelian, Sabellian, heretical terms, the Father and the Son. In Peircean, pragmatic logical terms, firstness and secondness. Do you see? Equal, right? Equal 3 persons, put it theologically. They equal 3 equal terms, logically put. Okay? So 2 equals, which is the transcription of 1 over 2, 1 equals 2/3. Transcription, 2 equals 1 times 3. Transcription, 2 equals 1 identical with 3. Right? So to go back to the discussion on Augustine, the one essence is identical with the 3 persons in theological terms. Or the 1 on the side of the equation, 1 equals 0, 1, and 1. 1 is identical with 3 in the logic, is the basic thrust here. But more particularly, the 2, where I would find 2, I understand that 2 to be equivalent to this identification of unity with 3. In Hegel, all right, so let's just continue the analysis here. Identically the unity of 3 absolute unities, 2 equals 1 times 3. The real unity of the Trinity before the creation, all right, now that before the creation is kind of a play on Hegel's way of putting things and maybe inferentially Maimonides. As distinguished from the notional trinity of absolute idealism, by which I have in mind Hegel, right? So in Hegel, I'm saying if I set it up by analogy to make the difference, in Hegel, 1 equals 1 times 3. Unity equals unity identical with 3. There's no real 2, is what it comes down to. Okay. Now, in my corrected version of the text there, as well as the logical trinity of the realism reducible to the latter, that is, now we're talking about Peirce, but distinguished there from transcendentally, which is absolute transcendental idealism, which is a way of I'm characterizing pragmatism, or logical realism, for which, corrected, 1 equals 2 times 3, right? So
You said 2/3 before.
well, okay, I misspoke. I want to put a
2 times 3.
yeah 1 equals 2 times 3. Yeah, I misspoke. All I wanted to do was to switch the 2 and the 1 in that equation, which would be, however, the equivalent then if I do the analogous transformation backwards, right? If 1 equals 2 times 3, then 3 is going to equal 1/2, or 2 is going to equal 1/3. Right? That's straightforward enough? Okay. And that latter way of transcribing it, make sure I don't misstate it, okay? 2 equals 1/3. 2 equals 1/3, which would be the Peircean analogy, is the bottom line result of the analysis of the straw man that Peirce presents. He gives me a situation in which, in fact, right, 2 boxes give me 6 values, which are 1/3 of the 18 results that he distributes in 2 double sets of 9. Right? So he gives me, in his analysis, without faulting him for doing his analysis in the middle of the 18th century, he gives me, according to his lights, quite logically, he gives me a distribution of two different sets of two things, right? All of which are abstractly, indifferently, could be anything that have no intrinsic intelligibility. He gives me an analysis, the bottom line result of which is that I have two boxes that contain 1/3 of the 18 boxes. I have two boxes of 2 9s, 3x3s. I have 18 boxes, 18 little boxes and 2 large boxes. The 6 values are distributed, right? The ultimate value is 1/3. You see what I'm saying?
The 6 values being after you've reduced everything to 1. I mean, reduced
No.
to 9.
Now we're talking about Peirce's
9 to
analysis.
6, I mean.
Huh?
We're just talking about Peirce's analysis?
Yeah, Peirce's analysis on 291. That's where we were, right?
Yeah.
So I'm saying, in his analysis of the relationship of two sets of 3 things,
Right.
which can be related in 6 different ways, when he goes to put those in logical boxes whose internal structure is determined by a form of external multiplication, right? Mm-hmm. Even though he could squeeze them in one box for the sake of neatness, he puts them in 2 boxes. But the real point is not that he puts them in 2 boxes, although he does. The real point is that he's got 6 different results, which, whether he distributes them in 2 boxes of 9 or 1 box of 18 values, the 6 is 1/3 of the total number of results that he has to account for, that he has to put in one box or another. So he has 18. He can't reduce the 18 to 9. Do you see? And Jim is saying, well, of course he can't reduce the 18 to 9 because he's starting with 6 different things, and you're starting with 3 different things. Do you see? So no wonder you're able to reduce your 6. Your 6 is only 2/3 of 9, whereas his 6 is 1/3 of 18. But that's because he starts with 6 different things, right? And you're starting with just 3 different things. That's the essence of the objection that's being made here, right? And I'm saying that that's not a problem because that's not the point. The point is these things here. The point is the symbols. It's not what's on the top and the bottom. He could have put. Yeah. Peirce could have put RST and RST on the bottom. He could have done the same thing I did with the logic. He could have done that with it. He would have gotten the same results, the same 6 different drawings of the relationships. Don't you see that? Put RST on the bottom, as well as the top. You would get the same 3 straight lines. You get 1x. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it doesn't make any difference that P is different than T. That's the whole point. It doesn't make any difference. Are you with me, Jim? You get it? It doesn't make any difference. You get the same 6 relationships. And I'm saying without whether I do it RST or whatever, in the case of the logic, I can't redo. In other words, if I don't know how to explain it. I couldn't reduce Peirce's. RST has no intrinsic logical relationship, you said, to itself. I'm not crazy about that terminology, all right? But it has no. These are arbitrary letters. They have no intrinsic relationship with one another.
You could just put 3 dots on the top.
You could put 3 dots. In fact, he says someplace that the dots have no meaning in and of themselves. He says that elsewhere in the chapter. He knows this, all right? He can arbitrarily, from his point of view, not from the... See, you can arbitrarily, in Peirce, you can arbitrarily introduce distinctions among otherwise intrinsically undifferentiated dots, and he does that with his day, night, dawn thing. Do you see? He does that. But for him, that's adding on to what he starts with was essentially undifferentiated dots or blanks or arbitrarily selected letters, right? The fact that there are only 3 digits, logically, to begin with in the real trinary logic, therefore, is not a weakness in the logic, it's a strength in the logic. If you have 3 different things that are intrinsically perfectly different from one another in their shared unity, okay, not only is there no need to have a fourth or a fifth or a sixth or an infinite number of numbers or digits, but it would be a weakness. You know what I'm saying? You would be running off into indefiniteness. You would be in what Hegel calls the bad infinite. Okay? So the objection is well raised. I don't know if it's well taken, but it's well raised, right? Because it's those lines between the two sets, right? And only if the two sets, not whether the two sets look alike, it's whether they have an intrinsic relationship as such to one another. Only then can they be reduced. All right. So Peirce gives us a doubling intrinsic to his methodology. Right. It's just where he was at. But it's an advance. It's an advance over Hegel. Right. And so, although Altizer thinks of himself as some sort of Hegelian, do you see? He's deeply not. He's deeply he's a product in the inverse and negative mode of pragmatism. It's Altizer has a notion of self-identity as a self-doubling identity, right? And that's rooted in the pragmatic advance over Hegel's 1 = 1 × 3. Do you see? Just come back to that page. All right. So where I've corrected the text there, 1 = 2 × 3, that is Peirce, the latter holding in the suspense of a real triadic dualism, the abstract triadic unity, 1 = 3. So I'm saying there, I'm acknowledging that he's advanced over Hegel, but incompletely, as it were, right? And so he's holding in suspense, right? He's called radically into question the 1 = 3, right? But he hasn't actually gotten beyond it, right? In the way in which the real trinary logic does. Thus, 1 = 2/3. This 1 = 2/3. 1 = 1.5 is the existence of logic, the logic of existence, and there are a number of ways in which that is borne out. So, for example, to come back to where we kind of started, I don't think we've gotten off the track. Actually, what we've done is kind of filled in some of the depth of this diagram on page 367. So when you come back to this diagram, which provides then the basis for what is called the absolute thought of absolute existence, the proportion 16 is to 24 is 24 is to 36, then now it takes on an even more interesting significance that the ratio is 1.5. In other words, it's the inverse of 2/3. All right, so this notion of unity is 2/3, right? That 1 = 2/3, 1 = 2/3, or 2 = 1 × 3, right? These are all different ways of saying, as it were, the identical thing, and that is deeply, thoroughly going through the whole logical analysis, so much so that when I wind up with this absolute proportion of absolute thought, right, I find that the ratio between the elements is again exactly 1.5, right? So to understand it, I've just put it there boldly there on page 367. The first is simple, 1 × 16. Then 1.5 × 16 gives me my 24. Did you see? Is that right? Yeah. And then 1 times that gives me my 24 again, and 1.5 times that gives me my 36. Right? So it's now this. I mean, I can't do justice to how thoroughgoing this is. When later on in the text, we're going to get to this thing which I call the L series, which is another form of a mathematical transcription, an arrangement of these same repeated, same set of same 3 damn digits. See, this is the same objection my eldest daughter, when I was doing this on a typewriter in my room 1,000 years ago, right? I was actually doing this stuff sitting there. And one day she came into my office, and I don't know when I took a break or something, she looked at the typewriter, she read a couple of lines, and she said, I don't mean this particular passage, right? Just the whole part. She says, seems to be a lot of repetition. You're like, kind of repeating yourself, right? And I thought to myself, well, that was a very acute observation, you see? And my answer to her, I don't know whether I gave it to her right on the spot, I probably had to think about it for a while, was of course. It's called the repetition that creates life. You see, in other words, what's the whole drive of science? To have 6 things? No, I'm sorry, it isn't. It's to have 3 things. You see? The whole drive of science is to reduce it to the least number of elements that will work and explain everything. That's what it's all about. So it's not so you should not be misled by the fact that you're doing the same thing over and over again, because as the L series will demonstrate, when I do this, well, I've already demonstrated to you with my triangle, my expanding triangle. The triangle, the first line is just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It isn't 1, 2, 3, by the way. It's 1, 0, unum, 1, 0, unum. Okay, that makes all the difference in the world, because it's 1, 0, unum repeated ad infinitum. I get an infinitely expanding triangle, which gives me the geometric series. Do you see? Okay, so one shouldn't be misled by simplicity or apparently unproductive, meaningless, because if you follow it out carefully, it's very productive. So the L series, we'll see, is a further application of this same basic principle, that by repeating the digits, and in that case assigning to them a cumulative value, I get a mathematical series which reads 1 plus 1.5, you see, which is the first thing after 1, plus 2, plus 2.5, plus 3, plus 3.5, plus 4, plus 5, plus 5 plus 5. So, in other words, the basic repeating element there is the 0.5, which is accumulating. It's a 1.5 type addition, right? And it produces a valuable infinite mathematical series. Okay. Let's see. While I'm hesitating here, if anybody has a question, you can pose it. All right, on page 360, well, we actually, skip that. All right, on page 375, which would get us into the beginning, at least, of today's assignment, I'm quoting Altizer, and what I want to say about what Altizer is saying, and what I am saying there in effect, is that passage that I'm quoting from him on page 375 and 376, it starts with his analysis of silence and its relationship to and what the silence means to him, and it's this silence that becomes real in being spoken, all right? And it's a form. On the top of 375, the top paragraph about 6 lines up, all identity then progressively becomes drawn into the actual silence of self-identity as the realization of that self-identity now actually and actively unsays all the naming of speech. And this unsaying is not the mere cessation of speech. It is far rather an unsaying which acts in its silencing. And this text of his is at least as difficult as mine. And so I thought it's a good challenge to try and make it crystal clear. Dropping down to 3, so he's shifting now. He's talking about the saying and the unsaying of speech and so forth. And toward the bottom of the page, he shifts a little bit into the relationship of presence and absence, okay? Which is another dimension of the same thing he's getting at. And so he says toward the bottom of 375, now presence becomes absence and becomes actual as absence, and that absence is the self-enactment of presence. Therefore, presence can now be actual only in its absence. And I thought, wait, Jesus, this is as bad as Leahy, right? Okay. So I said, I must be able to explain this simply, okay? And I can. It turns out I can. Now, if I don't trip myself up here right in midstream, what the death of God theology is all about in this self-silencing of speech, in this absence of presence, okay, is precisely the absence of presence. That is to say, presence is present as its own absence. That is, it is the door opening on nowhere. In other words, it's the full-blown experience of the void, of the abyss. But he says it's not a simple cessation of speech. Put it in theological terms, it's the undoing of the primordial God. It's the whole, if I can put it that way, without the W. You see? Or it's the whole without the W that could have a full-blown W, you see? It's the whole that's left in the absence of what was really present. You're saying, in other words, as opposed to Nietzsche, who doesn't really, he's not a theologian. I mean, we can make him a theologian, and we can understand him in a theological context, but Nietzsche's text, on the face of it, is just pure, bald, simple atheism, right? I mean, simple in the context. Whereas in Altizer, God really was. This God, this bad God, you see, really was and did us the service of putting himself out of existence, you see, of ceasing to be, of negating himself. He was, and I said probably only because he was a proto-pragmatist could he pull this off, right? Only in a truly evolutionary cosmology such as Peirce can we imagine metaphysically, as it were, ontologically, probably a better term here. Can we imagine ontologically actually achieving non-being? Well, in Altizer, the achievement of non-being is not piecemeal in an evolutionary tendency toward the realization in the future. You see, it's wholesale. Right? It's the total realization of non-being by the being that was. So we're left now with an right? So now we're left with that presence in the form of its absence. You see, and therefore we're left emptied out, devoid. We're left. You see, and so that's another. In this very abstract language, he's actually testifying to what I'm saying is wrong with Altizer, but not wrong in the sense that I'm trying to convict him of. Right? I'm not trying to convict Altizer's theology as it's rooted in pragmatism as it is. That I am trying to convict Peirce of not being now intellectually. You see, we have something new occurring. But what I'm saying is that. What Altizer testifies to is the vacuity in extremis of absolute modern self-consciousness. I mean, right, it's gone, and what remains is its having gone. Right, it's absent, but it's present in its absence. Right, in the form of its not being there. Right? We're in that sense we're still tied to it. We're still tied to the past. And so another way of putting it, which he may not be totally comfortable with, but the other languages he uses for this, what I'm calling now the escaping whole, this presence of what was in the form of its absence, you see, this void, this abyss, right? He calls the absolute future. But what I'm saying in effect here is that what is there in the form of the absolute future is the absolute tie to the past. Do you see? In other words, the past remains in the form of the absolute future in Altizer, just as the present remains in the form of its absence. It's that kind of situation. Okay, we pushed the clock, so we'll just stop there. I think we got through the most intricate part of the number business for the time being, and we can maybe play some more catch-up next time and get close.
Actually, we shouldn't be reading for the following session because we have read for this session, but we didn't really get into the session.
Yeah, but you should read for the next session because I'm going to try and play. I don't promise I'll be able to do it.